The next question that I want to get, it touches on Olam Haba as well. The Rambam's conception of man's ultimate purpose and perfection, and by extension his entrance to Olam Haba, the afterlife, is achieved via the study of Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava, also known as physics and metaphysics. Curiously, at the end of chapter 4 of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, after a lengthy explanation of this criteria, he seems to steer us in a different direction, stating that one should not study these matters until he has filled his belly with Talmudic mastery. He qualifies the reasoning with the idea that the Talmud study settles one's mind, and it is the inheritance given by God that every man, woman, and child can study it and receive Olam Haba. This seems difficult to understand, being that there is no obvious or overt link between Talmud study and the study of physics and metaphysics. How does Talmud study settle the mind in preparation for entering Pardes? And how can Talmud study alone be considered a gateway to Olam Haba, if the Rambam mentioned many times that only knowledge of God via physics and metaphysics can give man the perfection needed to achieve it?
Yeah, Rambam's attitude to Talmud study is really a fascinating subject in its own right. It's something which I explored in Judaism Reclaimed, and I'm planning to take much further in my upcoming book. There certainly seems, at least at first, to be contradictory indications. We find letters and writings where Rambam seems to be discouraging a too great a focus on Talmud learning, certainly when it comes at the expense of a proper understanding of God. Toward the end of Moreh Nevuchim, there's the famous palace parable, which depicts different grades of Jews with various forms of beliefs, knowledge, expertise. And this parable itself seems dismissive of Talmudists who've not really attempted to achieve any grasp of loftier, we call it philosophical or theological ideas. But as you've also indicated, there are very different messages elsewhere in Rambam's writings. We see, for example, in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, he describes how much wisdom there is present in the Gemara. He describes how the sages, the early sages, have walked these profound paths within the Talmud. And then, of course, as the source you quoted from Yesodei HaTorah, that before going too far down the route of Maaseh Bereshit and Merkava, one needs to have filled one's stomach with the investigations of Abai and Rava, the Havayat of Abai and Rava. So Abai and Rava were two later Talmudic sages. What are the Havayot? What are their investigations? And how can they contribute, as you said, to what you call physics and metaphysics, the more esoteric or the deeper aspects of the Torah that we have to understand? So in the first chapter of Hilchot Talmud Torah, towards the end of it, Rambam sets out his curriculum for Torah study, which he seems to assume will take up a good deal of a person's time. He says that a third of the time is Mikra, is learning the Tanakh. Another third is Torah Shel Baal Peh, which seems to refer to the known, transmitted and concluded laws. And a third is Gemara, or Talmud in some versions, some Girsot. So Gemara seems to represent the primary element of Talmud Torah. Once he says afterwards that once a person has mastered Mikra and Halacha, a majority, virtually all of one's learning time or study time should be spent on Gemara. And Gemara, among other things, it also involves Merkava and Maaseh Bereshit once one gets onto it, but it describes it as understanding and conceptualizing the ultimate derivation of a concept from its roots, inferring one concept from another and comparing concepts, understanding the Torah based on the principles of biblical exegesis, that is the hermeneutical principles, how we understand, how we can extract how the laws are derived and relate to the written Torah, until one appreciates the essence of those principles, how the prohibitions and other decisions which we've received according to the oral tradition can be derived from using them. So focusing back on the beginning, in particular, inferring concepts from another, comparing concepts, that is a very important point. Knowing what can be compared to another, what is analogous, and where to make a distinction between one thing and another. That's something which we find throughout the Talmud. Many of the Havayot, many of the investigations of Abai and Rava are talking about what is similar, how far we can extend the parameters of a rule, and when we distinguish a rule. Turning back to the Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkava, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim sets out a whole list of training and preparations that a person needs to go through before being ready to master these areas. And he says that you need an intensive curriculum, and that we need to train the mind and grant it the ability to draw inferences and know the truth. Again, it's about inferences, comparing matters one to the other. It's necessary for whoever wishes to achieve human perfection to train themselves at first in the art of logic and the mathematical sciences and the natural sciences. So you have to have knowledge of the world, and you have to know how to infer matters one from the other. So Talmudic study and analysis certainly requires one to master sophisticated logical structures, mathematical techniques as well, so there's many other forms of wisdom. The books written on this, Rav Nachum Rabinovich wrote a book on this. This is something I plan to go further in my next book. So first of all, we find that the Gemara contains various forms of analysis and reasoning, which can certainly train the mind in reasoning and logic, and these can serve as the preparatory skills for paradise. And this is how we can see how the mind must be prepared in order to go into the paradise. We see what happens with Acher, whose mind isn't prepared properly. He doesn't make the right analogies. We'll come back to that in a second. But if we see, Rambam describes what happens. These four people that go into paradise, the four sages that go into this great metaphysical paradise of reasoning, trying to understand the Maaseh Bereshit, trying to understand how God relates to the world. Rambam explains that Elisha ben Nevuah, Acher, failed partly because he made false analogies. He was unable to respect the limits of his intellectual ability. And it may not be a coincidence either that it was only Rabbi Akiva, the renowned master of the Talmudic skills and hermeneutics, who came through the paradise unscathed. He was the one who had the preparation, who had the mental maturity and training to be able to come through this. I would argue in addition to this, not just a matter of training, even if one doesn't ever get to the stage in which one is properly entering the paradise and studying esoteric matters, the Talmud trains a person's mind to view the world in an analytical manner, through the perspective of the oral tradition. And this is something which Rav Soloveitchik develops in Halachic Man in a lot of detail, very strongly, that really all aspects of our interaction with the physical world are governed by Halakha. And Halakha is supposed to be not as read from a Halakha book. In an ideal world, we'd be developing it and understanding it based on Talmudic reasoning. Before Rambam went and wrote down the code of Halakha was understood mostly through Talmudic reasoning. Abai and Rabbi and everyone else were making analogies, were understanding things, and all Halakha, everything we're doing in our life, all our interactions with the physical world are now governed through this great wisdom, which Rav Soloveitchik writes, can even grant a person some kind of divine perspective on the world. So again, how far we're going to take that, we can definitely see that the Havayot, these sorts of investigations of Abai and Rava can impact the way we look at the world.
So you're covering both parts. One, how it's hachana for the pardes, and then even if one does not enter the pardes, its own value in terms.
I don't think it's a binary. You either have or haven't entered the paradise. It's the more you're trained to develop, the way you look at the world, through a more sophisticated, mature way, you are more connected. If we go back to that channel, you connected to God in your interactions with the world. And something else I go to during the book, I'm not going to go through it all now, is that the sort of metaphors that Rambam uses, the gastronomic metaphors of food and drink, the lining the stomach with the Talmud study, very similar to the metaphors used in Moreh Nevuchim to describe acquisition of knowledge, and going into esoterics prematurely, trying to understand the Merkavah, trying to understand all these deep secrets of the world. He describes as having too much sickly, sweet food before one has had the sufficient bread and everything like that. So there's a certain consistency in Rambam's metaphors, which we can see the Talmud being a foundation, perhaps even a necessary foundation for the mind to train itself in a certain way before one tries to study the Merkavah and Maaseh Bereshit in any great detail.
Fascinating. For the last question on this podcast, hopefully we'll be able to have you on multiple times. For this podcast, we wanted to talk about the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah has long been a concept that has that has taken on many incarnations in Judaism. The notion of sacred space is difficult to understand, especially via the Rambam's firm contention on God's total transcendence. How are we to understand the concept of the Shekhinah according to the classical pre-Kabbalistic Jewish view?
So yeah, Shekhinah, the God's earthly dwelling, is a term with biblical roots, but which has come to be viewed predominantly in our generation as some sort of mystical phenomenon, some sort of presence of God, some sort of actual existence, some physical entity almost. But what on earth does it mean to say that God has some kind of presence or dwelling in certain constrained physical places? There are clear theological problems with placing God in the framework of space and time, as we touched on before. There's a transcendent God of the heavens on the one hand. We say he's Bashamayim Mima'al, he's in the heavens above, at the same time he's in the heavens, he's in the earth. He's not restricted and confined and defined by specific physical places. What does it mean to say he's dwelling he's dwelling now in one place? On the other hand, we do know that God is involved in worldly matters. We move to the Maharal, he calls it a fundamental principle of Judaism that certain places are holier than others. We find it right the way through the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem. The halachot will reflect this, the Beit HaMikdash. We definitely relate to this idea of certain spaces, times also I go into in the book, being holier than others. So we find the Kabbalah tries to resolve this by separating the transcendent Ein Sof, which is something which is beyond everything else, to emanated aspects which reside in the world, which leads to this notion of Shekhinah as some sort of actual spiritual entity. None of this really works so much for the Rambam, who regards God as completely transcendent, though he does allow as a concession, he writes in the Moreh Nevuchim, that it's permissible to view the Shekhinah as some kind of divine light. It may not be the most correct understanding, but he says it's not heretical, it's not problematic.
As a symbol, no?
Right, some sort of light, but it doesn't seem to be his what he actually regards it.
Right. As a symbol. Okay.
But how would Rambam actually understand Shekhinah? So I think we have to go now to the inauguration, the Chanukat HaBayit, the first Mikdash. There's a long speech and an impassioned prayer by Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, the wisest of all men. So he notes this problem straight off. He says, will God indeed dwell on the earth? The heaven and the heavens of heaven cannot contain you. Certainly not this temple that I've built. So Shlomo recognizes straight away that the whole idea of God dwelling in a physical building is bizarre. So how does he resolve it? So we see in the continuation of his speech, he then asks God the Mikdash be a place where people can come to pray, connect to God, have their prayers responded to, and this leads us to Rambam. In Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam understands this term Shekhinah, dwelling, to be a particular place which becomes subject to a permanent, heightened hashgacha, a stronger providential relationship that people can have with him there. But crucially, this is from our perspective. We can receive, as you touched on earlier, we are able to receive stronger signals in places such as the land of Israel, in Jerusalem, in the Beit HaMikdash. Our antenna can pick up these stronger signals. And this raises the stakes, both in terms of what we can achieve. We can forge a far stronger understanding of and connection to God. We can have a greater understanding, we can get flashes of understanding, flashes of inspiration to his greater providential relationship. And this is how we explain that there's a pasuk in Devarim about Einei Hashem, that the eyes of God are permanently in Eretz Yisrael. It means that when you're in a place which is holier, there's more Shekhinah, that just means that there's our antenna, our spiritual antenna, are able to pick up stronger signals. And therefore, the stakes are raised when it comes to providence. And in Judaism Reclaimed, they developed this theory of Shekhinah as some kind of hashgacha hotspot, particularly concentrating on explanations of Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Levi for the differential between the land of Israel and the rest of the world. So I look to apply this same idea to providential fluctuations with the concept of time also. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur are times that we're able to connect to God and receive this intuition, these flashes of understanding. Not that God is moving between places or changing between times, but that our minds, our souls are more able to pick up the signals for him in a more effective way.
But there's not intrinsic power within those times. There's not like
Right.
in the land itself. The land itself is not intrinsically holy. It's our presence and what we do there that elevates the
Our
land.
ability to become to have a more sophisticated relationship through that.
Right. As I bring down the Meshech Chochmah, he quotes the very Maimonidean section. It's sort of picked up by Professor Leibowitz, Vishay Leibowitz, that it's actually very destructive. It's almost idolatrous to say that the land or time is holy. And if you start viewing the land, even the Beit HaMikdash, as having innate spiritual value, that's coming close to idolatry. I think he famously called for the Kotel to be demolished as an idolatrous shrine. People were viewing it as having inherent. He was a provocateur as well, but he was making a serious point that if not, we can go along to a holy place and we can connect to Hashem, maybe in a more powerful way. But once we start attributing power and to certain spaces and places, then that's somewhat idolatrous. This is the Meshech Chochmah connects this idea of the Luchot. Once Moshe comes down and sees her dancing around the golden calf, he sees that they are attributing power to physicality. He says, well, what's the use of these Luchot? These are just, they're carrying a message from God. What all people do, in their mindset, they'll bow down to the Luchot. They'll revere them as being some sort of special, holy, magical power. So when he broke them, and God says, Yeshar Kochacha, well done, you're right to break them. So, and that is why, when they built a Mishkan afterwards, which is a holy place, the broken Luchot were put right in the middle in the Aron to remind people, no, the thing was actually written by God, the holiest thing you can imagine was broken because people got the wrong message. And that's a bit of a diversion. The idea being that greater Shekhinah means there's this greater, more intense providential relationship, and that creates creates higher stakes, both in terms of reward and punishment. After the golden calf, what do we find? When Moshe, he davens and he gets forgiveness for the people. So God says, I'm not going to come to your camp anymore. There'll be a malach that goes instead of me. That's saying that if I am there, meaning if there's this direct, more powerful providence, and everyone is connected to me in this very powerful way, and they sin, they're much more deserving of punishment. If a malach goes instead, that's somewhat less. And we find, I'll finish this up quickly, certain parallels. Nadav and Avihu, they bring Ketoret and they get burnt up because they're living in this very powerful, miraculous era where there's very strong providence. Uzziah HaMelech later on in Melachim, he brings Ketoret and he gets Sarat, same sin. He gets a lesser punishment because the stronger the Shekhinah, the higher the providence, the higher the stakes are. And this is really what Shekhinah means. It's this greater, more intense providential relationship, greater opportunities, and with it also really greater risks.
Wow, I love that whole thing you mentioned about the Kotel. I never heard that before. Actually, in Islam, they also kind of take a very strong stance against these ideas that can lead into idolatry, which actually never occurred to me before, but recently it was brought up. Even like the drawings, remember the cartoons, and I think it was Denmark cartoonists who drew like Muhammad and they killed him. And obviously that's obviously a crazy thing to do. But the reasoning and the rationale is that people might come to worship Muhammad, the prophet, and that we have to we cannot allow something like that to happen. So yeah, we have to draw a line somewhere. And Judaism, obviously they take a lot of this from Judaism, but
we don't know Moshe's burial spot.
Right. So it was going to lead to that. Exactly. Yep. So there's a lot of things like that in Judaism. The Torah kind of puts boundaries, between us and God, that this idea, even of the Shekhinah, there's all these boundaries. It's to explain to us that, it's our attempt to try to draw God close to us, but there's still a boundary where we cannot cross, where like you mentioned, the sons of Aaron, they unfortunately, even though they meant well, they did something that was not prescribed by God. So therefore, that's it. You're finished. And I think it's an important thing people really miss when trying to understand the Shekhinah. So thank you for explaining that very well. And before we go, before we go, we want to just ask you where we can find you, because we've been doing all these podcasts, and we never do this part actually, which is silly of us, but we should ask our guests, where can we find you, and maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on next for your next book. So please let us know.
So I can be found, I live in Rechavia in Yerushalayim. I have an online presence. I have a Facebook group, the Judaism Reclaimed Facebook group. I've got a judaismreclaimed.com, a website with various other information about the book. I'm working on a new book which takes some of the ideas from the things I've written about the oral tradition, the halacha, and how it's developed. It takes some of these ideas further. So I'm working on that at the moment. God willing, it'll be out another year or so.
Right.
In a sense, it's going to be like an expansion of Hakdama L'Mishnah of the Rambam in a way, like trying to get into more details of those ideas brought out.
Some of them, it's going to be taking the ideas and trying to work out based on the Rambam sort of where everything stands. Which aspects of the oral tradition do we understand came from Sinai, which were developed by later Beit Din HaGadol. If we have a Sanhedrin set up tomorrow, what could they change? What could they not change? Because it was part of the immutable tradition. How we can try and tell those things apart in the Gemara. And when there's no Sanhedrin, how does that affect things? What can we change? What can't we change? There are different approaches of, let's say, the Rambam, the Tosafos, and many of these other aspects.
That's
theological teachings in the Gemara.
That's very needed. That's actually something which I have a chavruta I learn with my friend. We do a double mission, and one of the things we keep talking about is how can we actually put into where can we fit on the map? You know what I mean? What would be considered something that you could say put into all the different concepts and putting them in its proper place. It's hard to do because the Rambam doesn't actually give that many examples. It's kind of like we have to kind of leave it to our own inferences to get there. So that's so valuable.
Trying to put together to collect a few different ideas, people have written on this, and try and put together some kind of guide.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's been a real honor.
Really appreciate everything. Fantastic.
Have a good one.
Thank you.